Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our live stream series. This is really just a test run of what we're going to be doing for over the next 10 weeks, beginning next week, where we'll bring you a special edition called Christianity in the Hot Seat. And what that is us addressing some of the most difficult questions that Christians may receive nowadays when they're out and about. We wanted to kind of take those to you. Originally, of course, this was going to be an event that was happening at our church. It was going to be 10 weeks long, but due to the coronavirus and all of the sheltering in place, we are now doing it live online, which is actually probably better for many of you who don't live close by, so folks can tune in and watch things like that. I am really excited about this series, though. So this isn't the series tonight. Tonight, I'm just doing a short teaching in order to see how well the system works, trying all the transitions. But the series itself we're planning starting it again next week, May 21st, 7 p.m. That'll be the official series. This can be what you would call maybe a bonus session for you. And we'll record all of these and have some opportunities for you to get notes for them and things like that. But I am excited about all the different stuff that we have available in order to do these kinds of things. And this is my first time using all of the live stream equipment, so I'm looking forward to hearing your responses, your suggestions, seeing how all of this comes together. And since I'm the guy that's not only giving the teaching but running all of the screens, I'm doing it from my chair, my desk. So yeah, that's what you'll see as well. We will have a chance at the end for you to ask questions. There is a chat function on the YouTube page that you can type in and let me know your questions so we can answer and things like that. That should be useful as well. But tonight, the thing I want to talk about is the resurrection. This isn't actually something, like I said, that we had listed as one of our top 10 questions. Thought it was appropriate enough to talk about ahead of time and give you something a little bit shorter. So today's topic is what we're calling the resurrection. Fraud, fable, or fact? And that's the question that we want to answer today. Now, I don't know if you realize this, but Christianity itself has always really hung itself by a single thread. It lives and dies by the question of the resurrection. And that's been true forever. Paul, when he was talking to the Corinthian church, and some in the Corinthian church doubted the resurrection, right? He tells them, he says, if Christ had not been raised, then our preaching is vain. Your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because if we testified against God that he raised Christ, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. Now, that's a pretty powerful passage that Paul is talking about here, because what he's doing is he's taking the truth claims of Christianity and hanging them on a historical event. The resurrection isn't something like the gods on Mount Olympus who you can postulate about, or whether you find yourself in Allah's good graces or things like that. It's something that happened here. It's something that happened on earth. It's something that can be testable, that men have actually witnessed. And we have writings from it, right? We have the 4 Gospels, for example. We have the letters of Paul. We have other things that argue that the resurrection actually happened. So when I look at this, one of the things that I see is I believe that when we're weighing the resurrection and asking the questions about it, really, there are only 3 options that are available to us. We can think that the resurrection accounts that we read in scriptures are frauds. They're forgeries. They're made up on purpose in order to advance some agenda. And many people hold this view. We can also think that perhaps the resurrection account isn't necessarily maliciously conceived, but it is a legend, a fairy tale, something that grew up over time. It's a fable. Lastly, the only other option available to us for this account is that the resurrection is actually fact. It's actually the Word of God. It actually is what happened. So the question now becomes, which one of these three is a choice for us? And that's what I want to do right now is look at each one of these. For fraud, let's take a look at one person's charge against the gospel, which is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a very famous New Testament scholar, and he holds that the New Testament accounts of the resurrection are not true. So Bart Ehrman has written, quote, "Many books of the New Testament were written by people who lied about their identity, claiming to be a famous apostle, Peter, Paul, or James, knowing full well they were someone else. In modern parlance, that is a lie, and the book written by someone who lies about his identity is a forgery." Now, that's a pretty hefty claim by Bart Ehrman. So how are we to understand this? How are we to approach and find out whether the Bible is a forgery or not? Is it fraud? How do we test for fables? Well, one way we can test is to look at where the Gospels were written. So let's take a look at this idea here. When we look at the Gospels, we know that the 4 Gospels were written in Koine Greek in the 1st century. They were written by 4 different people, somewhere between 35 to 65 years after the events they were recorded. So it wasn't the next day that the apostles came down and wrote the events of Jesus. It was about 30 to 60 years later, somewhere in that area. But there are 2 ideas as to who wrote them or where, as you heard Bart Ehrman saying that these were people who claimed to be apostles but weren't. A lot of more liberal scholars hold that Matthew was actually written probably somewhere in Judea, but Mark was written in Rome. This is the church tradition, holds that Mark wrote his gospel while he was in Rome. Luke was in either Antioch or Achaia when he was writing his accounts, and John was either in Turkey or Ephesus, somewhere in Asia Minor in that area. At the end of his ministry. That's what the church tradition holds. But mainstream scholars believe something different. They think that Matthew was probably written in Syria. Mark was in Syria, Luke was in Rome, and then John was in Palestine, Syria, and then Asia Minor, and it was all kind of compiled together. Now, those are mainstream scholars. Ehrman holds that all the Gospels were written outside Palestine. None of them have their roots in the actual area where these things take place. So that's the idea that he's promoting. And why is this a big deal where the Gospels are written? Well, it's a big deal because when you make a charge of forgery, you're saying that people are making up a lot of events. See, forging is actually very, very hard, right? There's the old story of the people at Scotland Yard who train investigators on how to identify counterfeit bills. They never let them handle any of the counterfeits. They let them handle the real money over and over again. And once you get so familiar with the real, of course, all the counterfeits show themselves easily, because there's a million things and a million ways to counterfeit things. But it's really hard to make a real bill. So when you're inventing a story, though, it becomes very difficult to invent a lot of details, okay? And one of the details that becomes even more difficult is names. Names are tough. Let me tell you, even remembering names is tough. I always have a difficult time remembering names. My wife makes a lot of fun of me because I'll usually get the first letter right. Hey, isn't that Janet? Oh, you mean Janine? Oh, yeah, that's it. Hey, isn't that Mary? You mean Margaret? Oh, yeah, that's right. So I'll get the first letter right a lot of times, but I have a harder time remembering people's names. Remembering names is a difficult thing. But if you think remembering names is tough, let me tell you, inventing names is tougher. Now, let me give you an example for this. Imagine you're an author and you want to write a story that's convincing. You want to put all the characters in the right locale and have everything appropriate to a time frame. You're going to write a story about Southern California, let's say, in the 1980s. What names would you choose to give the characters? Say these characters are supposed to be 20 to 30 years old. You have to choose names for the characters in the 1980s that were very popularly used to name their parents naming their children in the 1960s, right? Because 20 to 30-year-olds in the 80s, that means they were born in the 60s, and that's when all of those names start showing up. For example, in the whole idea in the 80s and 90s of everybody was naming their kid Jennifer and Jason, right? All the J names came into. And then in the 90s, you saw a lot of Tiffany's and those kinds of things. So you have to understand how names work in order to get kind of the names right. Now, let's make it one more step difficult, though. It's hard enough to go back and think about what names were popular back in those days. It's even harder if you were setting it in, say, Paris rather than Southern California. Now you're talking about a different country with different cultures and, it's easy to default to, Claude and Louis and all that stuff, those kind of silly anachronisms. But what really are the popular names of 1960s Paris? I couldn't tell you. Well, here's an interesting piece in all of this. This lady here, this is Tal Ilian, and she did something that's pretty interesting. Using supercomputers, she went through and started listing all of the names of all of the different people who've had their names documented through late antiquity in Judea. So we're talking about maybe 300 BC to 100 AD. Really about 70 AD, because that's when the Romans came in and wiped out Jerusalem. And turns out there's a lot of different ideas. There's a lot of different sources that she can get for those names. So let's take a look, for example, what you're talking about. So one of the choices that she used were the Gospels. So she looked at the 4 Gospels. She also looked at Josephus's writing, because he had a large collection there in Josephus's writing. There were ossuaries. Ossuaries are Jewish bone boxes that burial coffins, if you will, and people would write their names on the outside of those, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls and certain scraps of paper and things like that. And those are the 4 different areas that she was able to collate names to. And then she was able to take all of these different lists, and because she had, like I said, supercomputers today, she was able to run them through and find out which ones were the most popular at any given time. And it's pretty interesting what she found out. So if we were to compare, use our comparison that we were talking about today, for example, to what we're talking about with names, let's take a look and see how names change over time and how really it makes a difference where you are and when you lived. So these are popular names today. These were for a few years ago, 2010. You can see the most popular name is Jacob, then Ethan, Michael, Jaden, William, right? These are all boys' names. And not a ton of people, 1% of boys were named Jacob in 2010, and 1.17% of girls were named Isabel in today. But if we go back and we look at, say, 1980, here are the top 10 names. Oh, and there you see Jennifer right up on top, and Michael, much different than the names, popular names today of Jacob and Isabella, right? Christopher, Jason, David, Matthew, Heather, all of these things are a different percentage of names that people were using to name their children in 1980. Now, I want to just zoom in on two of these if I can. I want to zoom in on Matthew and Heather. So let's take a look at Matthew and Heather. They're both number 6 in 1980. But they didn't stay that way. They weren't always popular in that regard. If you look at, say, a table of different years, here we go. 1960, Matthew ranked 61st and Heather was 298th. You would just never find a Heather around. 1970, Matthew gained popularity, 24. Heather was 19. She jumped pretty significantly. 1980, they were both 6th, as I've shown. 1990, Matthew still held in high regard, 3. Heather, 19. The name Heather is starting to wane. And then, of course, 2000, 2010, you see it gets less and less popular. So if you're setting characters being born in 1980, naming them Matthew and Heather, probably a good call. There were a lot of those running around. But if you're writing today, would you have thought Heather or Matthew for your names? Well, when we look at this in terms of the names of Palestine, we see something very, very interesting. These are some of the reports that Tal Ilian did, and you can see by taking those 4 different accounts, she looks and sees that Simon or Simeon is the top name of a man at this time that Jesus lived in Judea. Okay, followed by Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, right? Jesus or Joshua, Ananias, Jonathan, Matthias, and so it goes. But notice one thing when you're looking at these lists. So the total shows from most popular to least popular. Look at the column right next to it, the New Testament accounts. You will notice that the most popular name we have from antiquity in archaeology is also the most popular name in the New Testament. There are more Simons. Simon appears more times in more characters than any other name. Also, Joseph is the second most popular as well in the New Testament as well as in all the documented history. And so it goes. There's one Lazarus, maybe 2 if you count the parable. Judas, John. But you see that the names in the New Testament follow very, very closely. And the frequency of those names tend to match very, very well. Now, Richard Bauckham understood this. And what he did was when he was looking at these things, he started to say, that's pretty remarkable that the authors of the 4 Gospels would get these things right. How could they know? How could they do that? You know, in other words, when you are trying to say that this is a forgery, one of the things that you're claiming is that these guys made up the names, made up the other characters that interacted with Jesus, and made up the events. Yet they get all of the names right. And they get them in the right frequency. Now, you may say, well, yeah, but that's because, everybody was named that in those days. Well, let's take a look at the actual stats here. The top 2 male names. What are the top 2 male names in Simeon and Joseph? They appear across all of the records of Israel about 15.6% of the time. In the Gospel and Acts, if you count them both together, 18.2% of the time. For the top 9 male names, 41.5% of the time, that's taking them as an aggregate. And they appear in the Gospel and Acts 40% of the time. These are really close numbers. They're not just estimate. They're really close. The top 2 female names, Mary and Salome, 28% of the times in Israel, 38.9% of the times in the Gospel of Acts. There's a little bit of a difference there. Of course, there's a bigger divergence in that Mary takes a much more prominent share. About 25% of all females in Palestine were named Mary at that time. And there's far fewer female characters in the gospel accounts that we read from. So that's part of those issues there. But the top 9 female names still show up 49% of the time in throughout Israel are in 61% of the gospel accounts. Now, that's pretty amazing. I think that's a pretty good track record. It's evidence, right? I mean, you say, well, what's the big deal about all these? Well, all we're doing is we're trying to investigate the claim as whether this was a forgery. And if it was a forgery, you wouldn't expect something as inconsequential as the frequency of names to be as close as what we're seeing today. Well, everybody used those names. Those were just popular Jewish names at the time, somebody will say. That's not necessarily true, because what we found is that when you look at the names in Palestine versus the names of Jewish people who lived in other countries, it's far different. The names of people in other countries tended to be more politically driven rather than religiously driven. What do I mean by that? Well, say you wanted to name your son something. You could look to your political heroes, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, name him after that, or you can look to your popular movie stars, right? One of the reasons why the name Heather exploded was because of Heather Locklear coming on screen. In the mid-90s, Ross became a very popular name, and Rachel became a very popular name. Can anybody guess why? Yeah, that's right. It was because Friends became popular and everybody started using those kinds of names for their kids. So if we look at the names outside of Palestine, what we see are Eliezer, Sabbatius, Joseph, Doisathy, Pappus, Ptolemaeus. All these names are historical figures who were popular in Jewish political history, but they weren't necessarily driven by the religious nature of those in Palestine. So the Jews in Palestine had a very different naming convention than the Jews outside of Palestine. And remember, Bart Ehrman claims that all of the Gospels were written outside of Palestine. And that's what we see. We see that names outside of Palestine would have a far different flavor, even within a Jewish community. Now, how could all of these Gospels get the frequency of names inside Palestine right if they're being written outside of Palestine 35 to 65 years later? I don't see how they can do that. That's why Richard Bauckham says in his quote, and let me blow it up for you so that you can see it fully. The names of the Palestinian Jews in the Gospel and Acts coincide very closely with the names of the general population of Jewish Palestine in this period, but not to the names of Jews in the diaspora. In this light, it becomes very unlikely that those in the Gospels are accreditations to the traditions. In other words, it's hard to believe that these were just simply made up names. There's a lot more that I can share about the names, including things like very frequent names like Simon would usually be followed by an identifier. So, for example, you'd have Simon the Tanner and Simon Bar-Jonah and Simon of Cyrene. So you get all these different identifiers for a name like Simon. Why are they using those identifiers? Because, how can you tell your Simon from your Simon otherwise, right? Jesus of Nazareth. But when you get somebody like Bartholomew, which is not in the high frequency list that we looked at, all of a sudden you don't have to have an identifier with that, because there aren't that many Bartholomews around. Everybody knows who you're talking about. So there's other hints in the text to show that really what we're looking at is something that's been pulled from history. See, there's really no logical connection between names and people. Names don't really imply anything. But it does show that these names give us a level of confidence that what we're reading is something that happened in reality. The types of names that they're talking about are Jewish from within Palestine. Their frequency is correct. All of these things work together. Now, there's other reasons to trust the historical accuracy that these are coming from history. The Gospels get several historical details right that are minute, whether to call a person, say, something akin to either a mayor or a burgermeister, for example, depending on the town you're in. Luke gets aspects like that right. They use embarrassing stories in the accounts. You know, if you're making up a hero story, you wouldn't want to use a lot of embarrassing details, either about yourself or about your hero that you're trying to promote. And those happen all the time. Historians look at facts like multiple attestation, that this is quoted not only by one account, but by several accounts that independently corroborate the evidence. And of course, there's a lot of non-biblical sources that talk about Jesus as well. So when you wrap all these things together, it really doesn't make sense that we would think that the gospel accounts are fraud. So that brings me to my second question. What about the second option, fable? What if the Gospels are fable? And this has been something that's been popularized as well. A lot of people tend to hold on to it. One very popular individual, John Dominic Crossan, formerly of the Jesus Seminar, has said something to this effect. He says, Jesus was probably buried in a shallow grave, and his body had been eaten by dogs. And that's really what happened to him. And then this fable, this idea of Jesus as a resurrected being, came out of that. So how do we understand and figure out fable? Well, the best thing to do is, again, turn to history. How do historians look at ancient stories and find out whether they're factual or not? Maybe one of the ways we can do is look at a guy like Alexander the Great. Okay, Alexander the Great, we all know the story of Alexander the Great, one of the most important figures of ancient world. He's the one that made everyone start speaking Greek, for example, and paved the way for the Roman conquest as well. And Alexander, we know, was born in 365 BC. He had military campaigns that lasted some 11 years of his life, where he supposedly swept across the east, conquered the known world more or less at its time, any place that was worthy of being conquered, and died at the age of 31 in 323 BC. You know, the story goes that he fell on his bed because he wept because there were no more kingdoms left for him to conquer. And when he dies of an illness at 31, they ask him, who did we give the kingdom to? And he says, give it to the strong. And it goes on from there. But these are all facts that most historians agree to readily. Now, how do we know these facts? What makes them facts? Well, the earliest account that we have of Alexander was written by Diodorus in the 1st century BC. That's the one that we have in our hands, a 1st century BC account. Alexander was born 356, he died in 323, so this is some 200 years later. But realize we only have 5 or so accounts of Alexander's exploits, and the main one that we draw upon, the biggest history, is through Arrian and Plutarch, and they were written in the 2nd century AD. So we're talking about having a fairly strong understanding of Alexander's exploits. Again, most historians hold that these things are true, with basically 5 accounts. The earliest is some 200 years after his death. The most complete is some 300 to 400 years after his death. 2nd century AD would be, about 500 years after his death. But they don't necessarily say that we have to throw these things out. They're not, dismissing these completely. They are, by most accounts, historical records. We trust the ancient sources. Why do I bring this into account? Well, it's because when we look at the resurrection accounts, we find something very interesting in comparison. When you look at the resurrection accounts, one of the things that you'll find is that Mark is probably writing between 55 and 58 AD, right? Matthew was somewhere between 59 and 62 AD. John, between 89 to 95 AD or so. And then 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter that I quoted at the beginning, between 53 and 55 AD. And that's where he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, and most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Now, here's the key. In all of these accounts, what we're looking at is a gap of, what did I say, 30 years to 60 years? Not 200 years to 500 years, right? You can develop fables and legends after a long period of time, but these are key accounts. And a matter of fact, when Paul's writing, he's saying that Jesus appeared to specific brethren who you can go and talk to today. Not that this was something that happened so far in the back you can't check it out. That you were going to something that you can ask people today, right? Most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, is the way he says it. But here's the big piece in this passage. It's that first verse where he says, "For I delivered to you that which I also received." Now, most scholars today understand this to be one of the early Christian creeds, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. That when you became a Christian, this is one of the belief statements that you would say. And when Paul says, "I'm going to give it to you the way I learned it, I give unto you that which I first received," that means Paul learned it to say this, to become a Christian. Well, if Paul's writing in about AD 53, that makes it pretty interesting, because let's take a look at the timeline of Paul's journey and see if I can highlight this just a little bit more. Okay, if we take a look at Paul's timeline, the first thing that we know is that he writes, the crucifixion happens in AD 30, let's say. Let's give it that, AD 30. Luke writes the book of Acts in AD 62 that talks about Paul's exploits. One of the things it does talk about is when Paul went to Corinth. It's Acts chapter 18. So we know that Paul showed up in Corinth right about AD 50. That's why we can date the book somewhere between AD 50 and AD 53. He spent 3 years there, right? But he said he gave to the Corinthians, when he was there in AD 50, what he first received. When did Paul first receive this? Well, Paul receives the resurrection story on his road to Damascus, right about AD 36. So now we're talking about a resurrection account that's not coming from the 50s, it's coming from AD 36. But in order for it to be established in AD 36, that means it had to have been held, believed, written down, and turned into a creed, so to speak, much earlier than that. That means that the creed had to be first formed somewhere between AD 33 and AD 35, perhaps. Some hold even earlier than that. Some people believe it was within the first 6 months of Christianity. Now, 6 months after an event, to form a legend like this, that's really not a lot of time. How in the world can you deal with this? So, if we're comparing these kinds of things, I think it becomes very helpful for us to look at what's trusted, say Alexander's history, and the resurrection's accounts of Jesus, right? Historic accounts of Alexander the Great, the most detailed, 5 centuries after it was written. The earliest account, some 3 centuries after the events that they record. But the historic accounts for the resurrection, the most detailed, is only 30 years later by living witnesses. And the earliest is maybe 2 years later, maybe less, we don't know. Now, let's go back and look at our test again. What does Paul tell us? He says, if Christ had not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, for your faith is also in vain. Moreover, we are found to be false witnesses of God, because we are testified against God that he raised Christ. If Christ had not been raised, your faith is worthless. Now, why would Paul hang all of Christianity on that single thread? Because he knew the thread was true. You see, if the resurrection accounts aren't fraud, and if the resurrection accounts aren't fable, that only gives us one choice. They must be fact. And that's why we believe in Christianity. Now, I hope you've enjoyed that. And I hope you'll give me some feedback. In the YouTube Live page, you do have a live chat button, and I've hooked it up here so that you can go ahead and type in if you have questions, ideas, or you want clarity on anything. That's one of the things that we're going to be able to do, is take these questions and take these concerns. I know you can't talk back to me. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, but you can actually talk back via the chat function, ask a question, and I would do my best to answer that in any way you can. So feel free to send me questions. Also, if you would like to keep in touch, you can keep in touch through any one of my social media channels. You have the webpage, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all of those kinds of things. Usually it's anything/come-reason, and you'll be able to find me. But that's what I have offered for you today. So yeah, I'll wait for a couple of seconds to see if anyone would have any comments or questions that they would like to tackle. And if not, we'll go ahead and close our time together. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to get some feedback as well from you as we begin to do this series next week, and really enjoyed our time together. So, okay. Well, thanks guys for watching. Have a good time, and I'll see you starting next week.